Picture a valley at dawn. The mist still clings to the ground, and two armies stand frozen on opposite hills, close enough to hear each other breathe. For 40 days, nothing has happened. No arrows, no charge, no blood, just waiting. And then, every single morning, the silence is broken by the sound of heavy footsteps and a voice so loud it seems to shake the stones underfoot. A figure steps out from the enemy ranks. He is enormous. His armor catches the morning light like a wall of bronze, and he begins to shout, taunting an entire nation, daring any man alive to come and face him. His name was Goliath. And for centuries, that name has meant one thing: an impossible enemy, a mountain of a man that no one dared to challenge. But who was he really? Where did he come from? Was he truly a giant, or has the story grown taller with time? And why does a battle fought more than 3,000 years ago still echo in the way we talk about courage, fear, and the fights that seem far too big to win? Today, we are going to walk through the entire story of Goliath. Not just the famous moment everyone knows, but the world he lived in, the fear he created, and the strange, unforgettable way his life came to an end. Stick with me all the way to the finish, because there are details in this story that most people have never heard. And by the end, you may see this ancient giant in a completely new light. Before we step into that valley, do me one small favor. If you enjoy stories from the Bible told in a way that actually brings the ancient world to life, take a second to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. That little bell is what tells you the moment a new story goes live, so you never miss what comes next. All right, let us begin. To understand Goliath, we first have to understand where he came from. Goliath was a Philistine, and to the people of ancient Israel, that single word carried a weight of fear and hatred that is hard to overstate. The Philistines were not a small band of raiders. They were a powerful, organized people who had settled along the coast of the land, controlling a group of 5 major cities. They were skilled warriors, but more than that, they held a secret advantage that made them nearly untouchable for generations. They understood iron. While much of the surrounding world was still fighting with bronze, the Philistines had mastered the working of iron weapons and tools. Iron is harder. Iron holds an edge longer. Iron can cut through bronze. This gave them a technological edge on the battlefield, and they guarded that knowledge jealously. The Bible even tells us that at one point there was not a blacksmith to be found among the Israelites, because the Philistines had made sure of it. They did not want their enemies learning how to forge iron swords and spears. So imagine the imbalance. One side with the newest weapons of the age, and the other often forced to fight with farming tools and whatever they could find. This was the world into which Goliath marched. He was not just a big man from a hostile tribe. He was the champion of the most feared military power in the region, a nation that had spent years pressing in on Israel, taking land, winning battles, and spreading terror wherever they went. And into that already frightening picture steps a warrior unlike any other. The Bible describes Goliath with remarkable detail, almost as if the writer wanted you to feel the size of him. He came from the city of Gath, one of the 5 great Philistine strongholds, and his height is given as 6 cubits and a span. Now, depending on how you measure an ancient cubit, That places him somewhere around 9 feet tall, and even in the most conservative readings, well over 7 feet. Either way, he towered over every man on that battlefield. He was a living wall of muscle and menace. But it was not just his height. It was what he wore and what he carried. The description of his armor reads almost like an inventory of intimidation. On his head sat a helmet of bronze. His body was covered by a coat of scale armor. And here the text gives us a number that is meant to stop you in your tracks. That armor weighed about 5,000 shekels of bronze, which translates to somewhere around 125 pounds of metal. Just the armor. He wore bronze guards on his legs, and slung between his shoulders was a bronze javelin. Then there was the spear. The shaft of his spear is described as being like a weaver's beam, a thick wooden pole, and the iron point of that spear alone weighed 600 shekels, roughly 15 pounds. 15 pounds of iron on the tip of a spear. That is not a weapon meant simply to wound. That is a weapon meant to punch straight through a shield and the man behind it. And as if all that were not enough, the Bible mentions that a shield bearer walked ahead of him, carrying an additional heavy shield. So Goliath came fully protected, from head to foot, with a personal servant clearing his path. Everything about the way he was described was designed to send a single message. This is a man you cannot beat. This is a fight you cannot win. And for 40 long days, every soldier in the army of Israel believed exactly that. Now, let us set the scene of the standoff itself. The two armies had gathered in a place called the Valley of Elah. The Israelites camped on one hillside, the Philistines on the other, with the valley floor between them. Neither side wanted to charge down into the open and up the other slope, because doing so would mean fighting uphill at a terrible disadvantage. So they waited, staring at each other across the divide. And this is where Goliath introduced a kind of warfare that was common in the ancient world. Instead of two full armies smashing into each other and losing thousands of men, the outcome could be decided by single combat. One champion against another. Winner takes all. Each morning and each evening, Goliath would stride out into the valley and roar his challenge across to the Israelite lines. "Choose a man," he shouted. "Send him down to me. If he kills me, we will become your servants. But if I kill him, then you will serve us. Give me a man, that we may fight together." Think about the psychological pressure of that. It was not just a challenge to fight. It was a bet placed on the freedom of an entire people. Whoever stepped forward carried the fate of the whole nation on his shoulders. And whoever refused had to live with the shame of watching this foreign giant mock them, day after day after day. The Bible tells us that when Saul, the king of Israel, and all his men heard these words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The king himself, a man described as standing head and shoulders above his own people, would not go. His best soldiers would not go. 40 days passed, morning and evening, and the giant kept coming, and no one moved. You can almost feel the despair settling over that camp. Every dawn brought the same booming voice. Every evening brought the same humiliation. The longer it went on, the more impossible it seemed. Fear has a way of growing when you stare at it long enough, and Goliath had given them 40 days to stare. And then Into this frozen standoff walks a shepherd boy. He was not a soldier. He had not come to fight. He had come to bring food. His name was David, the youngest of 8 brothers, so young and so overlooked that when his father wanted someone to check on the older boys serving in the army, David was the natural errand runner. His 3 eldest brothers were among Saul's troops, and their father sent David with bread and grain and cheese, partly to feed them and partly just to hear how they were doing. David arrived at the camp at the very moment the armies were shouting their war cries and moving into position. He ran to the front lines to find his brothers, and while he was talking with them, out came Goliath, right on schedule, bellowing his usual challenge. And David watched as the reaction rippled through the army. The men of Israel, at the sight of the giant, fled from him in great fear. These were grown warriors, and they scattered like leaves at the sound of his voice. But David saw something the others had stopped seeing. While everyone else looked at Goliath and saw a giant, David looked at the situation and asked a question that cut straight through the fear. "Who is this Philistine," he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" To David, the giant was not the biggest thing on that battlefield. He was, at his core, a man mocking God. And to David, that was not intimidating. It was offensive. Word of the boy's questions and his boldness eventually reached King Saul, who called for him. And here we get one of the great conversations of the whole story. Saul looked at this young man and said what any reasonable person would say. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are just a youth, and he has been a warrior since his own youth. In other words, be realistic. You are a boy. He has killed men for a living your entire life." But David answered with a story. He told the king that while keeping his father's sheep, a lion and a bear had come and carried off a lamb from the flock, and David had gone after them, struck them, and rescued the lamb. When the beasts turned on him, he seized them and killed them. "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear," he said, "and this Philistine will be like one of them." Then he added the words that reveal the true heart of his courage. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." David's confidence did not come from his own size or strength. He knew perfectly well he was smaller and weaker than the giant. His confidence came from experience and from faith. He had faced impossible odds before, out in the wilderness where no one was watching, and he had survived. That quiet, unseen preparation had built something in him that all the trained soldiers in that camp were missing. He believed the outcome did not depend on his strength alone. Saul, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of a flicker of hope, agreed to let him go. And in a moment that is almost tender, the king tried to help. He dressed David in his own armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of mail on his body, and David strapped on the sword and tried to walk, but it did not fit. He was not used to it. This was a suit built for a seasoned soldier, not a shepherd. And David made a decision that tells you everything about him. He took it all off. "I cannot go in these," he said, "for I am not used to them." Instead, David went to the one thing he did know. He took his staff in his hand, went down to the stream in the valley, and carefully chose 5 smooth stones, placing them in his shepherd's bag. and in his hand he held a sling. Now, do not picture a child's toy. In the ancient world, the sling was a genuine weapon of war, and a skilled slinger was deadly. A stone launched from an expert sling could travel with tremendous speed and force, accurate over a surprising distance. Shepherds used them to drive off predators, and David had clearly spent countless hours mastering his. He was not walking out unarmed. He was walking out with the weapon he had trained on his whole life against a man loaded down with weapons built for close combat. And so the moment finally came that 40 days of fear had been building toward. The shepherd stepped down into the valley to face the giant. When Goliath saw who was coming, he was insulted. He had waited more than a month for a worthy opponent, and Israel had sent him a boy with a stick. The Bible says he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. "Am I a dog," the giant roared, "that you come to me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods and promised to give his flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. It was the last taunt of a man who was absolutely certain he had already won. But David answered him, and his reply is one of the boldest speeches in the entire Bible. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin," he said. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." David did not deny that he was outmatched in weapons and size. He simply declared that the fight was about something bigger than either of them, and that the outcome had already been decided. Then everything happened fast. Goliath moved forward to attack, his heavy armor and massive spear making him a slow, unstoppable force. But David did not wait. He did not hesitate or back away. The text says he ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the giant. He reached into his bag, took out a stone, put it in his sling, and let it fly. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead, in the one place his armor did not cover. It sank in, and the giant fell face down on the ground. In a single instant, the terror of 40 days was ended. The champion of the Philistines, the man in 125 pounds of armor with a 15-pound spear point, was brought down by a shepherd, a sling, and a small smooth stone. There is something worth pausing on here. Goliath's greatest strength was, in a strange way, his greatest weakness. He was built for one kind of fight, standing toe-to-toe, crushing his enemy up close with brute force and heavy iron. All his armor, all his weight, all his weapons assumed his opponent would come to him and fight on his terms. But David refused to play that game. He stayed at a distance and used speed and skill where the giant had planned for strength. The very things that made Goliath so frightening, his size and his armor, made him slow. And against a fast, precise attack from far away, all that bronze protected everything except the small patch of forehead that mattered most. David then ran and stood over the fallen giant. Having no sword of his own, he took Goliath's own sword, drew it from its sheath, and used the giant's own weapon to make certain the battle was over. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, their courage collapsed. The very fear they had used to paralyze Israel now turned on them. They broke and ran, and the armies of Israel, suddenly filled with courage, rose up and pursued them. The standoff that had frozen an entire nation for 40 days was shattered in a matter of moments, all because one young man refused to measure the enemy by his size. Now, here is a detail that often gets overlooked, and it adds a fascinating layer to the story. Remember those 5 stones David chose? He only needed 1. So why gather 5? People have wondered about this for a very long time. Some suggest it was simple wisdom and preparation, having extra stones ready in case the first throw missed. Others point to something intriguing, found later in the biblical record. There are hints that Goliath was not entirely alone. Other passages mention warriors of unusual size connected to the same region and family, sometimes described as descendants of a line of giants. In fact, later in the story of Israel, David's own men are recorded fighting and defeating several other giant warriors, one of whom is even said to have had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So perhaps David, ever practical, came prepared for the possibility of facing more than one. Whatever the reason, the image of a boy calmly selecting 5 stones before facing an army speaks to a mind that was clear and steady even in the face of the impossible. It is also worth asking a harder question. Was Goliath real? For a long time, some treated the whole account as pure legend, a symbolic tale of the underdog rather than history. But the world of the Philistines is very real, well documented, and confirmed by archaeology. Their cities, including Gath, the very city Goliath is said to have come from, have been located and excavated. Digs at the site of ancient Gath have revealed a large, powerful Philistine city, exactly where the Bible places it, thriving in the right period. Archaeologists have even uncovered an inscription there containing names that are strikingly similar in form to the name Goliath, suggesting that names like his were genuinely in use among the Philistines of that time and place. None of this proves every detail of the duel, but it firmly grounds the story in a real people, a real city, and a real historical moment. This was not a fairy tale set in nowhere. It was a story rooted in a world we can dig up and touch. And there is more to consider about the man himself. In the ancient world, warriors of extraordinary size were not merely fighters. They were weapons of fear. Long before an arrow was ever fired, a champion like Goliath was meant to break the will of the enemy just by existing. Nations would place their tallest, strongest men on the front line precisely because a single terrifying figure could do the work of 1,000 soldiers, freezing an entire army in place with dread. That is exactly what Goliath accomplished for 40 days. He never lifted a finger against Israel in those weeks, and yet he defeated them every single morning, simply by being too frightening to face. His true weapon was not the spear or the sword. It was the fear he planted in the minds of the men who watched him. And fear, once it takes root, does not need a giant to keep it alive. That is why what David did was so remarkable. He did not just defeat a man. He broke a spell that had held an entire nation captive. So what do we make of Goliath all these centuries later? On the surface, he is the villain, the towering bully who terrorized a nation and got what was coming to him. And that is true. But his story has become so much more than a single battle. His name has entered the language of the whole world. When we talk about a small business taking on a massive corporation, or an ordinary person standing up to a powerful institution, or any moment when the weak confront the strong, we call it a David and Goliath story. Goliath has become the eternal symbol of the overwhelming obstacle, the enemy that looks unbeatable, the problem so large it seems pointless to even try. And that is exactly why his story still matters, because everyone at some point stands in that valley. Everyone faces a moment when the thing in front of them looks far too big, when fear says, "Do not even bother," when the smart, realistic voice says, "You cannot win." Goliath represents every one of those giants: the diagnosis, the debt, the addiction, the grief, the dream that everyone says is impossible, the enemy that has been shouting at you morning and evening for so long that you have started to believe it can never be beaten. The lesson buried in this ancient story is not that giants are not real. Goliath was very real and very dangerous. The lesson is that the size of the enemy is not the thing that decides the outcome. For 40 days, an entire army looked at Goliath and saw only his size. One young man looked at the same giant and saw something the others had forgotten, that no enemy, however large, is bigger than the God he trusted. The difference between David and everyone else on that battlefield was not strength or weapons or courage in the ordinary sense. It was perspective. Everyone else measured the giant against themselves and gave up. David measured the giant against something far greater and ran forward. There is one more quiet truth in this story that is easy to miss. David did not become a giant slayer in that valley. He became one in the wilderness, alone, when no one was watching, facing the lion and the bear with no audience and no applause. The victory that made him famous was built on 100 smaller victories that no one ever saw. And that is worth remembering. The battles we win in private, the courage we build when no one is looking, the faith we practice in the small and forgotten moments, those are what prepare us for the giant that shows up in public. David was ready for Goliath because he had already been faithful with the sheep. So the next time you find yourself in your own Valley of Elah, staring up at something that seems far too big to face, remember the shepherd boy and the giant. Remember that armor and size and loud threats are not the same as invincibility. Remember that the loudest enemy is often the slowest. And remember that the fight was never really about how big the giant was. It was about who the boy believed was standing behind him. The giant fell. And he has been falling in stories and sermons and songs ever since. A reminder that the impossible is not always as impossible as it shouts. Goliath was the ancient giant who defied Israel, but in the end, he is remembered less for how he lived and more for how he fell, brought down not by a greater army, but by a single act of courage and faith from the most unlikely person in the valley. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and walking through this incredible story. If it moved you, or if you learned something new, that is exactly why this channel exists. If you have not already, please subscribe and tap the bell icon so you are notified the very moment the next story goes live. There are so many more powerful accounts from the Bible waiting to be explored, giants and kings, miracles and mysteries, and I would love for you to be here when we tell them. Until next time, keep facing your giants, and remember, it is not the size of the enemy in front of you that decides the outcome. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.